Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, the show where we unpack the key issues from Palestine and the wider region. I am joined, as always, by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Nassim. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Last 2 weeks, understandably, we were focusing on Iran because it's dominating the coverage. We spent large portion of our show on that. But today, um, I want to begin with Gaza, in particular, talks of a ceasefire. So let's get cracking on that. I mean, there are signs of negotiations taking place, and we are, moving towards a ceasefire. Do you see that in the horizon? Is that something? I know Netanyahu is again for the third time now, I think, is traveling to Washington since Trump was became president. So Netanyahu's going in the next 2 weeks, and I don't know. What are your feelings? What are the
Mm.
discussions around negotiations ceasefire?
It's impossible to tell. I was just perusing social media before we started, and someone was suggesting that Netanyahu be given a desk in an office in the White House's West Wing because he's such a valued guest in Washington. You mentioned Iran, and all these things are interconnected. Um, there appears to be renewed momentum towards a deal because at a time when the war in Gaza was becoming increasingly unpopular within Israel, which for the most part had nothing to do with the issue of genocide or the Palestinians, but because there's widespread recognition that Israel's captives can only be retrieved in the context of a deal that ends the war, and that this prolonged military campaign is putting growing strain on the Israeli military and particularly its ground forces, while the Israeli war against Iran was enormously popular with the Israeli public. Um, there's a view that Netanyahu is now in a much better position to conclude a deal regarding the Gaza Strip without paying a heavy political price in terms of the potential defections from his coalition government and so on. Secondly, there is also suggestions that the United States, having managed to impose a cessation of hostilities between Israel and Iran, now wants to expand the circle of stability, if you will, and get back to a deal in Gaza between Israel and Hamas that would see again the release of the remaining Israeli captives. That in a sense is the main U.S. interest. What happens with the Palestinians or Palestinian captives is an at best secondary concern. And we've also seen during this past week, which we'll probably discuss later, um, Trump now threatening, making a not so veiled threat about withholding U.S. aid to Israel, not because of anything Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip or to the Palestinians, but he's doing this as a way to pressure the Israeli judiciary and the Israeli legislature to basically abort the multiple criminal trials of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been indicted on a number of corruption and national security charges. This appears to be actually an initiative that began with Netanyahu, who is said to have told Trump when he was asked about the possibility of resuming negotiations for a Gaza deal that he cannot do so while he's under investigation and on trial because he would lack the credibility to conclude a deal. Now, the problem, of course, here is that neither Israel nor even more so the United States have any credibility left when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to concluding agreements, when it comes to respecting what they've agreed to. We saw this most recently, of course, where the US used the last round of its negotiations with the Iranians as camouflage to lull Tehran into a false sense of security in order to increase the surprise element of the initial Israeli attack. But we saw this already in January and February, rather, when the United States, having forced Israel to accept a multi-stage deal with the Palestinians, then shifted the goalpost several weeks after implementation began. And when the Palestinians refused revised U.S. proposals, effectively a rewriting of the agreement, the U.S. then stood firmly behind an intensification of the genocide and the siege and so on. And given all the different voices we're hearing now from the Israelis, from the Americans, from the Palestinians, one is on the one hand inclined to see all this noise and movement as indications of an approaching deal, while at the same time it could just be you know, camouflage. It could just be meaningless diversion. It's interesting, horrific, but interesting that we've seen a real intensification of the Israeli bombings in the Gaza Strip in the last several days. Really horrific scenes where they're just basically dropping high explosives on it, on anything that moves, particularly in the northern Gaza Strip. Is this the final furious storm before the calm, or has Israel obtained an approval from Washington to intensify the genocide as the price of agreeing to a ceasefire with Iran? We really don't know at this stage. I mean, we can kind of look at the tea leaves and try to read them, but there are so many leaves pointing in so many different directions that it would be foolhardy to say that things are definitely going in one direction or another. The one thing we do know is that the Palestinians are in a position where they really cannot show any significant further flexibility because their demands are already minimal. They basically amount to a conclusive end to Israel's genocidal military campaign, a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and an exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians. And this could happen all in one go or in a staged process. But the things that are now being proposed, such as the exile of Hamas leaders from the Gaza Strip, as if they're in Lebanon in 1982 and not in Palestine in 2025. In my view, that's wishful thinking. In my view, that's designed to put forward conditions designed to be rejected, to perhaps float a trial balloon if Hamas is willing to commit political suicide. And if any agreement is dependent on these kinds of conditions, then we can already conclude that it's not going to happen.
I mean, you mentioned the increase in bombing of Gaza, and many people have pointed out there has been a lack of attention in Gaza. The West seems more obsessed about what the chant of a rap artist than the actual situation in Gaza and what the IDF is doing. And one of the revelations from last week, which should have been, center stage in every single mainstream news, is the fact that Israeli soldiers confessed to Harrods, revealed to Harrods that there's a killing spree, or the Palestinians seeking aid was being shot by Israeli soldiers, directly shot. So that kind of put clarified what many Palestinians have been saying all along, but of course Israel has consistently refused that. Netanyahu came out and said that the allegations are blood libel, even
Of
though it was
course.
Israeli soldiers who are making the allegations or confirming what the Palestinians have been saying all along, that we are being shot as we are seeking to get aid from the Gaza aid distribution center, the one that was run by the Israelis. So I mean, one of the quotes I found really revealing is by an Israeli soldier who said that there isn't any interest in Gaza anymore. Said one reservist, it's become a place with its own set of rules. The loss of human lives means nothing. It's not even an unfortunate incident. That's how he described the situation in Gaza. So I just want to get your thoughts on this coverage by Harris, and I think it was a really amazing coverage. I know many Palestinians have commented and said that, Palestinians have been saying this since May, when the Israelis set up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, bypassing the UN and the various other aid agencies, and they've been killing Palestinians deliberately. Now, Harris comes out and confirms their report, and this seems now to get some kind of validity, dismissing what the Palestinians have been saying for the past 3 months.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, from the moment that this Orwellian named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set up by the Israeli military in close cooperation with the United States, the Palestinians and international aid agencies, the UN, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, Norwegian Refugee Council, basically everyone who had been actively involved in humanitarian relief efforts in the Gaza Strip for the past 2 years has said that not only is this a disaster waiting to happen, but it was designed to produce precisely the kinds of horrific scenes of slaughter that we've been seeing on a daily basis since the day that it began operations. Jeremy Konindink, if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, a former senior USAID official, U.S. Agency for International Development, who was formerly, I think, director of its crisis team and is now president of Refugees International, has written a series of posts on Twitter explaining exactly how and why this is a disaster, and explaining exactly why these kinds of massacres were a foregone conclusion. Because when you have a situation as desperate as that of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the only reasonable and effective approach is to flood the population with relief supplies, precisely in order to avoid chaos, anarchy, violence, and so on. What the Israelis have done is they have basically disabled the UN and the international aid agencies and prohibited them from operating in the Gaza Strip by denying them the ability to import any supplies. And they have replaced the approximately 400 aid distribution points in the Gaza Strip with just four, and that were out of reach for many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And what they have done is to transform what appear to be aid distribution centers into kill zones. I presume most of our viewers are familiar with the kind of daily bloodletting that goes on at these places. But of course, as soon as it started, on the one hand, you had the Israelis, as they do with everything else, saying this is fabrication. This never happened. This is a blood libel. Nothing of the sort is even happening. And then you had the fanatic ideologue and Christian Zionist, Reverend Johnny Moore, who's the head of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, saying, well, yes, these things are happening, but it's because Hamas is massacring Palestinians every time they come to try to collect aid from the Americans, because that's, the ideology. And then you had this curious incident where one of Israel's better known apologists, who goes by the name of Colonel Richard Kemp, went on a guided tour of one of these kill zones with the Israeli military and was producing a report explaining how absolutely grateful the Palestinians are that the Israelis and the Americans have had the humanity to establish this place. And then, as he's concluding his report, you can hear gunfire in the background, which kind of, obliterates the entire purpose of his apologia. Now, what Palestinians and these international aid agencies have been saying from the outset has been substantiated over and over and over again. But given the way, the international media works, you could think of it as the case for the prosecution, and then this article by Haaretz as a confession on the witness stand by the accused criminal. And so it does have significance in that respect because these are the people directly responsible for the slaughter, for the massacre, explaining that they're the ones who were doing it and it's not others, explaining that they have the absolute authority to do it because they've been given that authority, and suggesting that there's a policy of this. These are not rogue soldiers violating instructions, but these are people acting in accordance with the open fire regulations, in accordance with a policy to conduct precisely these kinds of slaughters. And the Haaretz headline in the English language newspaper said that soldiers are being ordered or instructed to shoot at desperate, defenseless civilians trying to access aid in these human abattoirs. And then, of course, the Israelis and their flunkies start screaming blood libel, anti-Semitism, and whatever their other catchphrases are. And then it turns out, well, there was a slight mistranslation. They're not ordered to shoot at Palestinians, but directed to shoot in the direction of the Palestinians. At the end of the day, they're still aiming for the head and the heart. But this very slight mistranslation somehow proves that this entire report is a fabrication and meaningless. And, it's important here also because the narrative from Israel and its apologists has been these things simply never happened. People weren't killed, and if they were, it was because they were killed by Hamas. And so now all of a sudden, they're confronted with this evidence, first in Haaretz newspaper, and just as importantly, now the Israeli military itself is confirming that these incidents took place. Of course, to point out that they're now, very intensively investigating them to see if any crimes were committed and that they've issued strict orders about this, that, and the other. But we've seen this repeatedly. Israel sends out its message to the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra how to respond to substantiated allegations. Israel's flunkies and apologists resort to simply denying reality as opposed to increasingly just denying this never happened, this is Pallywood, this is Gaza wood, and so on, instead of trying to justify it because it's so impossible to justify crimes of this nature. They simply deny that they exist. And then gradually the truth comes out and it becomes so indisputable that in the end, the criminal is forced to confirm that these crimes are in fact occurring. And the wonder here is that time after time after time after time, the Western media, the BBC, the New York Times, and all the rest of them, deal with Israeli denials as if, there is no record of systematic fabrication, lying, prevarication, and so on. They're given the benefit of the doubt and they're allowed to set the tone of the discussion time after time after time. And it's not that the media never learns. The media knows exactly what's going on. But, they're committed to a certain political and ideological agenda. And that determines the way that they repeatedly report these things before they're left with no choice but to begin reporting the truth, but only after the Israelis confirm what Palestinians and others have been saying from the outset.
And I think it's because the horrors in Gaza are just so unimaginable that that is one of the reasons why um, they create moral panics out of, for example, the chant of a rap star, and as a form of distraction. And I think we will get to that, but um, because I don't think they're willing to recognize that the genocide and the atrocities that are being supported by the West. I mean, UK today, for example, or yesterday, the High Court ruled that selling arms to sustain the F-35 fighter jets is not illegal. So there was a case in the UK. So the UK is still going to fund UK fighter jets, and instead of looking at what you're supporting, they seem more inclined to create moral panic about the chant of a rap star, which we'll get to later on. And talking about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, um, so far, I mean, I think something like 600 have been killed while seeking aid. More than 4,000 have been injured, and that's of course part of a much broader picture of the level of death and destruction that's taking place in Gaza, which is what I wanted to ask you about next. There's a new study that just came out um, titled "Violent and Non-Violent Death Tolls from the Gaza War," and they say the death toll is much, much higher. It could be as high as 75,200. And it seems like when all this is when the genocide comes to an end, I think the figure which was initially cited by Lancet back in 2024, just last year, of 186,000 deaths. I think that's where we're heading out, given that there are now new reports, new studies showing that what we hear in terms of the death toll is actually an underestimation. At the moment, the numbers are 56,000 death, but new studies are showing that it's much, much higher. Lancet, which made the highest estimation, which is 186,000, which will be the final result of death from the war, including indirect deaths as well.
Well, what this all comes down to is the nature of reporting by the health ministry in the Gaza Strip, what is known to the BBC as the Hamas-run Hamas Gaza Hamas Health Hamas Ministry. Um, Look, the health ministry in the Gaza Strip has an established record of reliability and credibility. Its data is considered reliable by US and Israeli intelligence. In each previous Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip, its data and statistics have been thoroughly and intensively examined after the conclusion of hostilities with about 1 million fine-toothed combs. And the only thing that has been found are minor errors that reflect kind of ordinary errors involved with data collection rather than any indication of politically motivated data manipulation. And shockingly, despite the extraordinarily difficult, impossible circumstances under which the health ministry has been operating for almost 2 years, which includes repeated direct attacks on the ministry, on its staff, on its ability to collect data and report, its credibility remains undiminished. And some Israel apologists, like Andrew Fox and another fellow named Eisenberg and so on, have, during the past 2 years, seized on every error to to basically delegitimize and demonize and denounce the health ministry as some kind of propaganda outfit that is inventing data out of thin air in order to make Israel look bad. Well, of course, the health ministry has made errors, in some in some cases significant errors. But what is also true is that the health ministry has consistently corrected those errors, and the ones who have been fabricating evidence is not the health ministry, but rather the Israel apologists who have been attacking it. Matthew Cockerill has done very extensive research on this. His most recent report was published by Action on Armed Violence, AOAV, a highly reputable international organization that looks into conflict casualty data and statistics and so on. And he did one on a recent report where something like, I believe, 1,500 Palestinian children were included in the data produced by the health ministry. And it was said, claimed by Fox and his partners in crime, that these children had never been killed. In fact, what happened is that the health ministry, if I got my facts right, removed them from its roster of casualties because it had insufficient data confirming that they were in fact deaths directly attributable to Israeli military action, and then added most of them back. So these accusations actually prove the thoroughness, the integrity, the reliability, the credibility of the Palestinian Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip. Now, regarding these horrifying statistics that you just mentioned, this is not the only one that has concluded that given the conservative approach to data by the Ministry of Health, where they will only record and confirm the name of a casualty if they have, a name, an identity number, and further elements of confirmation. They do not, for example, record the names of people who've been buried under the rubble for 16 months and so on. It's now clear that the data provided by the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip errs on the side of caution. In other words, it's conservative and leaves important data out. And then, of course, with increasingly as time moves on, the proportion of indirect deaths is increasing. People who die of hunger, infants who die of thirst, people who are unable to get medication because it's prevented from entering the Gaza Strip and so on. And you take these numbers together, you look at them as an objective researcher who wants to provide a realistic and credibly realistic figure rather than being the Gaza Ministry of Health, which will err enormously on the side of caution in order not to provide a single excuse to Israel flunkies to try to denigrate its entire reputation. And you get these numbers, which in fact very significantly exceed the official casualty figure.
I mean, if anyone's interested, I mean, do search for the research. It's called Gaza Mortality Survey. It's easily accessible online. And as you mentioned, I mean, every instance or report I've read about Hamas revising its numbers, it actually goes against its own propaganda. So, I mean, this idea that these numbers are somehow fabricated, why would anyone revise numbers if it goes against the propaganda which they're trying to promote, which is that more and more, thousands and thousands of Palestinians are being killed. Um, uh, I guess related to that is also something. I mean, the situation in the West Bank, where again there's a pogrom that's taking place, but there isn't as much condemnation, as you would expect. Um, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that, partly on the um, some of the analysis that there is the part of the deal which Netanyahu is striking with Trump is that Netanyahu will be given the West Bank. The West Bank will be annexed, and these are just reports, of course. And I'm wondering if last week's pogrom, which is how Harris described this situation in the West Bank, saying there's a quiet pogrom taking place. Is anything? It's not really quiet. If it's live streamed, as just as the case in the Gaza Strip, where there is a live stream genocide. So why? I mean, I guess the question is why the escalation now? This is an ongoing cycle, but last week's burning of cars, burning of houses, and the attack on a mainly Christian village was more violent than anything we've seen over the past couple of weeks and months, I would say.
Mm.
Do you think, of course, part of it is the sense of entitlement, impunity they feel they have, and also, I guess they must feel, they will not be held to account, the Israeli settlers, that is, and they probably do feel, the West Bank is going to be annexed, and we may as well try and ethnically cleanse as many Palestinians as we can before a deal is struck
Mm.
where the rights to the West Bank is given to Israel.
Yeah. Before we move on from Gaza, I just want to make one last point because we discussed the GHF, and that is that earlier today, Tuesday, the 1st of July, 138 organizations released a collective letter calling for GHF to be abolished because it is essentially an abomination that violates every principle of humanitarian action and demanded that the pre-existing uh, aid distribution network and system be allowed to function again. Now, of course, Israel claims that establishing these kill zones was necessary because Hamas was stealing the aid and so on. I think we've discussed this previously. That was entirely debunked. And in fact, this past week, a number of Palestinian police officers who had seized aid looted by collaborationist militias with Israel and were distributing it in Deir al-Balah were bombed and killed. There is looting, but that is primarily the work of these gangsters and their gangs affiliated with Israel, armed by it, protected by it, and so on. And secondly, and less frequently, by desperate Palestinians seeking to grab what they can from these trucks. Now, regarding the West Bank, yes, we have already this year seen a consistent increase in the intensity of Israeli violence in the West Bank, first and foremost by the Israeli military, but also, as you mentioned, by its settler auxiliaries who've been carrying out near daily pogroms, not just in the northern West Bank, which had been the military's main areas of operation, Jenin, Tulkarem, Tubas, now increasingly Nablus. But these are operating everywhere. And what's interesting is that in the past week, they carried out two particularly noteworthy indiscriminate attacks. One on the village of Turmusaya, which is north of Ramallah. And that one is notable because approximately 75 to 80% of this village's residents are American citizens. And, the Americans always like to brag that if you harm, a single hair on the head of an American citizen, we will pursue you to the ends of the earth and ensure you're brought to justice and so on. It's absolute BS. I mean, the Israelis had killed a 14-year-old boy from this same village last year who was a U.S. citizen. And the only discernible sound from the U.S. was applause, and statements about Israel's right to defend itself. Shireen Abu Akleh, most famously, the iconic Al Jazeera correspondent, U.S. citizen. Anthony Blinken basically moved hell and high water to cover up for Israel's crime of murder. So this idea that the U.S. gives a damn about foreigners murdering its citizens, it
Yeah,
failed.
it's always an odd one. I mean, when Christian Americans wade into this and provide unquestioned support to Israel, and here you are, Palestinian Christians are being
Mm,
ethnically cleansed. There's a complete silence. I mean, that image is also
yeah,
similar to, for example, Christian American congressmen who are always seen next to the wall, Wailing Wall, but they're never seen in the most holiest Christian site, which is probably a few hundred meters away. They're
yeah,
never seen entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre,
yeah,
for example,
yeah,
but they're
yeah,
always seen, or the images of them are shared across the globe of them near the wall, but never
yes,
entering the church, which is
yeah.
100 meters away. Why is that? I mean, that's a question
Mm,
which American Christians need to ask themselves. Why do we need our leaders to be in this Jewish holy site and not the Christian holy site, the most
mm.
holiest site in Christianity, which is a few hundred meters away?
Well, it's important to understand, Christian Zionists don't view Palestinian Christians, and of course, the first Christians were the Christians of Palestine. So these are the descendants of the people who gave these ideologues their religion in the first place. They don't view um, uh, Palestinian Christians as how should I put it? As
Well,
co-religionists
yes. Yeah.
deserving of their support and sustenance, as people whose rights need to be defended, as the last remnants of Christianity in the land of its birth after the Nakba and everything that's happened since 1967. They view them as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of their crazy millenarian agenda of bringing about the second coming and Armageddon and so on. They view Christian Palestinians not as allies, but as enemies who need to be eliminated, because if you don't get rid of them, you can't have the world blow up and the rapture and all the rest of it. So it's a very bizarre and quite morbid approach, but they probably view them as jihadists for all I know.
Mm.
But getting back, yes, the U.S. will pursue, or at least pretend to pursue, those who harm U.S. citizens abroad if it aligns with, if it's good for propaganda purposes or is done by an adversary. So an American dies in prison in North Korea, or gets imprisoned in Russia, yes, then the U.S. will act. But the Israeli military kills several U.S. citizens a year. Nothing to see here. They genuinely don't give a damn. And they're telling the Israelis, you can do to our citizens whatever we want, because in your case, we won't even make we won't even, make statements opposing the murder of U.S. citizens. It's
Mm.
just it's a slogan. It's just a slogan, and
Mm.
there is a test for the seriousness of repeated U.S. claims that anyone who so much as touches a hair on the head of an American citizen abroad will be brought to justice. No, they're applauding it in the case of Israel murdering Palestinians who hold U.S. citizenship.
Mm. Yeah, before we move on to some of the other regional issues, I wanted to mention a development in the Israeli Knesset, which is, I think, quite important for us to comment on, which is the situation around Ayman Odeh. So there's an attempt to impeach him, and I think it's successful at the moment. So I mean, there are Israeli ministers who say all kind of genocidal things, but why is Odeh facing impeachment? And so, can you shed some light on that?
No, because he's an Arab. I mean, you ask a simple question, you get a simple answer. Because it's an apartheid state. because Israel views itself not as a state of its citizens, and this is, I'm talking here about formalities. Israel does not define itself as a state of its citizens in which every citizen has equal rights. Israel defines itself as the state of the Jewish people, meaning that non-citizen Jews have more constitutional rights in Israel than non-Jews who are citizens. And Israel, a number of years ago, I think in 2018, went even further and passed a basic law, which is, somewhat equivalent to a constitutional amendment, that states word for word that only the Jewish people have the right of self-determination in the land of Israel. In other words, everyone else get lost. Only the Afrikaners have rights here. That's exactly what it means. And Ayman Odeh made some statements. I unfortunately can't remember precisely what, but I think it was, accusing Israel of he's a member of parliament, and should enjoy parliamentary immunity, which he does. But what you do then is you start impeachment proceedings against him, meaning that if a majority in parliament votes to expel him from the parliament, he is no longer a member of parliament, can then also be put on trial and so on. Israel has a long history of this, of in the 50s and 60s banning political parties on the grounds that they embraced Palestinian or Arab nationalist principles, or banning parties because they don't recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state and so on. And at one point in the 1980s, it also banned the party established by Meir Kahane, formally on the grounds that it was openly racist, but practically because it represented an electoral threat to the Likud and its successor organization, Jewish Power, now has several members in parliament, and its leader, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is one of the most senior ministers in the Israeli government. And he and others are making racist, openly genocidal statements around the clock, to the extent that they left even their close allies in London and the British government with no option but to sanction them. But that is of no concern because, it's an apartheid state, and Afrikaners are allowed to denounce the quote unquote kafirs, but the members of the subordinate population commit a crime when they demand equal rights.
Let's turn back to the issue you raised earlier, which is Trump wading into Israel's internal politics and threatening to cut aid unless Israel ends what Trump calls a witch hunt against Benjamin Netanyahu. That's what he said in his Truth social media. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary threat to pull aid if they don't stop the witch hunt. I mean, it seems to me that the row, well, the alleged row between Trump and Netanyahu, or differences they had, I think that was overplayed. It seems like in every instance since Trump has done everything to benefit Netanyahu, and this is another gift to Netanyahu. And maybe the ceasefire that we are expecting or anticipating is also going to be timed so that it's a gift to Netanyahu. I've seen video of Netanyahu being received in Israel with chants of King of Israel, King of Israel. So I think that there's an effort to change change his image and increases image in the polls, that is. And do you think that's kind of Maria Edelson effect? I mean, her intervening and telling Trump, who is a close Edelson, that is, close confidant of Netanyahu, and also the biggest donor of Trump, calling the shots here. I mean, what do you think is happening? Why would an American president come out like that and threaten to pull aid to Israel and and describe what is happening to Netanyahu as a witch hunt, which is an internal Israeli affair. So yeah, just get your thoughts on that.
Look, I do think it's fair to say that Trump's instincts are pro-Israeli and that his instincts are anti-Palestinian, anti-Iranian, and so on. But Trump's instincts are also, pro-Saudi, pro-Emirati, pro-Qatari. And as far as Miriam Adelson or any other donor is concerned, I genuinely believe that Trump's loyalty to them and promises to them cease to be relevant the moment the donation arrives in the bank. Trump has a history of screwing over every single person he's done business with, from construction workers in New York, building his projects, to his mega donors. So, in that sense, I don't think he's owned by his funders in the way, in the sense that Bill Ackman would like the the world to work. What I think and having said that, I also do think there are policy differences between Netanyahu and Trump. As the analyst Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute has pointed out, Trump has demonstrated an ability to say no to Israel. What he hasn't demonstrated is an ability to sustain that no to Israel, so that it repeatedly, eventually, transforms into a yes. And of course, there are also serious divisions within the Trump administration, within the Republican congressional delegation, and U.S. political elites more broadly on this issue, as we saw so visibly during the war on Iran. What I suspect happened here, as I was suggesting earlier, is that after the conclusion of the Iran ceasefire, which may or may not last, but that's a separate issue. Trump and the person who effectively functions as a Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, sought to renew negotiations on a Gaza ceasefire because they want to achieve a deal that results in the release of the remaining captives in the Gaza Strip, and probably see a bit of stability in that corner of the Middle East as a useful thing. And Netanyahu engaged with them, but also explained to them that if you want me to conclude a deal, I cannot do so while I'm under criminal indictment and on trial, because my motives will be questioned, and any agreement that I reach will be denounced and delegitimized as Netanyahu acting in his personal rather than national interest. So I need to, if you can help me get rid of this trial, it would be very helpful. And so here I think the initiative came from Netanyahu rather than from Trump. And there's some reporting in the Israeli media that supports this. And, what possibly, and Netanyahu was pushing it an open door. Uh, you know, who more than Trump hates judicial investigations, corruption trials, convictions for the kinds of things Netanyahu is accused of? And, he pulled out one of his favorite terms, witch hunt, which he's been using against efforts to hold him accountable for over a decade now. And I think that's the genesis of the story. Whether it will succeed or not is a different question. One hopes that the Israeli judiciary stiffens its spine, not so much because, these issues of whether Netanyahu is tried and convicted are of any interest, but to see if Trump is as good as his word and does suspend aid to Israel unless the Israeli judiciary drop its case. That to me would be the ideal outcome. The U.S. cuts off aid, and and Israel continues with this trial. But I'm not ruling it out, but I think it's very unlikely to develop that way.
And then let's pick up from last week, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. So there doesn't seem to be any conclusive um, report suggesting that the Iranian nuclear facilities have been permanently destroyed. If anything, it seems to be the contrary. Iran claims victory. And I mean, another indication that even the Americans and the Israelis think it hasn't been destroyed is the talk of renewing strikes again or not launching another military operation, which suggests that even the Americans and the Israelis believe that their first operation, the initial operation, had failed. So, what do you make of that? I mean, is there talks of another strike on Iran?
Well, look, even before Israel launched its war on Iran, um, all the leading specialists on this issue were saying two things. The first is that you cannot, to use Trump's term, obliterate the Iranian nuclear program from the air, and that the most that you can do is inflict serious damage, which will at best set it back by a few months, at the expense of giving Iran the motivation to probably want to break out from its nuclear threshold status. But the second and more important thing they were saying is that the level of technical and scientific knowledge and equipment and material is so extensive within Iran that even if you completely destroyed the physical infrastructure that Iran has built up over the years, that Iran retains the expertise and know-how to reconstitute this, probably quite rapidly. And so the real question now is not whether or not the US has and Israel have destroyed Iran's nuclear program, but rather something else. To what extent have they managed to set it back? And to what extent have they persuaded the Iranians that their nuclear threshold status should no longer be a bargaining chip with the West, but rather a platform to move rapidly forward to achieve the ultimate deterrent? And I think that question remains unanswered. The second point is that of renewed negotiations. And the indications so far are that the US is pressing the Iranians to return to the negotiating table. And while contacts are being engaged primarily through the Omani mediators, passing messages back and forth, the Iranians are not yet prepared to return to negotiations because they view Washington as a serial violator whose commitments are worth less than hot air. And so the challenge now is going to be to find a way to get Iran to be persuaded that the US is a sufficiently credible negotiating partner for Tehran to want to re-engage with it. And hanging over this is a more immediate threat that, yes, a ceasefire was reached, but Israel and increasingly the United States have been issuing statements that, as far as they are concerned, their model for the ceasefire with Iran is Lebanon, where Iran is expected to strictly adhere to the terms that were agreed, but Israel and the United States retain the freedom to bomb Iran at will every time they think that they have evidence that Iran is trying to reconstitute its nuclear program or whatever. It's going to be, and that is a recipe for prolonged war because, of course, Iran wasn't defeated, and more specifically, its ballistic missile program was not eliminated. So it's going to be a rather different situation than the one you have in Lebanon, where Hezbollah was not defeated and its arsenal was not eliminated, but there are domestic, not only Israeli, but also domestic constraints that prevent it from responding to these attacks.
Mm. I mean, I was going to ask also about Syria, but I think we are quite a long way into the conversation. And let's finish with the situation, well, the two events related to Zohran Mamdani and Bob Villan. So the backlash, as most of you have been watching, has been Huge. There are, of course, two different issues, but Mamdani won the nomination to be the Democrat candidate for New York governor, and Villain, who is a British rapper, who he
A
chanted,
rapping duo.
yeah, he chanted, death, death to the IDF during the Glastonbury Festival. But I guess, but both are similar in the sense that they pushed the entire what you call the Haspara Symphony Orchestra into a complete meltdown. But I guess serious point here is that I mean in the US that with Mamdani winning, do you think that is a result of Israel fatigue? And here you have a young candidate who does not share the same kind of loyalty and affinity to Israel in the way other establishment figures do. And I guess will the Democrats take the right lesson from Mamdani's victory?
Mm. Well, to take Mamdani first, I mean, it's very interesting. Those who have examined it more closely than I care to, um, have repeatedly said that the reason Mamdani won is because he relentlessly focused on local issues. He relentlessly focused on things that the New York City electorate genuinely cares about and feels that it's directly affected by. He also,
America first agenda.
sorry?
America first.
Yes, yes, ironically enough.
Ironically,
Yeah,
sorry.
and of course he also ran a brilliant and very effective campaign and so on. Um, his opponents, in this case,
Kumo,
yeah, not Mario, Andrew
Andrew Kumo.
Cuomo, who's who's a corrupt sex pest and also happens to be part of legal team of Benjamin Netanyahu at the International Criminal Court, decided that the best way to tear apart Mamdani was to transform the New York primary into the Tel Aviv primary and to make it a referendum, this Democratic Party primary, make it a referendum on support for Israel. And on that basis, of course, there was widespread distaste, personal distastes for Cuomo and all the rest of it, but that's why he lost. He wanted people to vote as if they were selecting candidates for the Israeli parliament rather than mayor of New York. And what has happened since then is that the Democratic Party machine and its consultants and the leadership of pro-Israel organizations like the Defamation League and so on have begun this concerted campaign to compel Mamdani, what Yasser Arafat used to call the striptease. You remove one item of clothing, hoping to satisfy the audience, but the minute you take it off, they only want their appetite to see you remove even more clothes only increases. And so now the campaign is focused on getting Mamdani to condemn something he never said, globalize the Intifada. He didn't use that slogan, but unless he condemns it, sorry, want to make sure. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. There was a light going on in
Okay,
the
no,
car.
so 17. So I'll tell them we had a disruption. It's fine. Carry on.
Yeah. Um, well, I hope it hasn't been like this the entire time,
No,
but
no, no, no. I've been hearing you fine.
but the idea is to get Mamdani to condemn something he never said, because if he doesn't condemn it, that means he agrees with it and so on. And then this is the chink in the armor. And then the next demand will be, do you condemn this? Do you recognize this? And in the end, he will have be left with nothing and stand naked in front of his constituents and supporters who will turn their back on him because he will have disillusioned his own supporters just as much as all the other candidates have
Managed to do.
disillusioned theirs.
Mm.
That's one line of attack. But at the same time, what I also find interesting is, the primary came with an extraordinarily unprecedented amount of Islamophobia. I mean, you had senior US politicians basically saying Mamdani is a Muslim and he should be disqualified for that reason alone. You know, not an Islamist, a Muslim. And that in and of itself, well, I mean, can you imagine, you
I
know,
mean, one is seeking to strip him of his citizenship,
yeah, and
but
deport. And can you
it's just
imagine,
incredible.
you know, if a prominent journalist or elected official came up and said, you know, Bloomberg should never become mayor of New York because he's a Jew? Can you
Yeah,
imagine that? But that's exactly what's being said about
Mamdani.
Mamdani, and it's incredible. So. But the new line of it, after having seen how that not only failed but backfired, the new line of attack, of course, is that he is a communist and wants to transform New York City into Leningrad on the Hudson, you know, because he wants to introduce some mildly social democratic initiatives that wouldn't raise an eyebrow, even in David Cameron's Britain, and so, you know, things even George Osborne wouldn't reject.
Hmm. I mean, just as the term anti-Semitism is being hollowed out of any meaning because of the constant use, and I think here as well, the word Islamism is also been hollowed out because they're using that term to define, describe people like Mamdani. Mamdani is anything but an Islamist, and if you look at
Mm,
him, if you look at his lifestyle, you know, it's anything but an Islamist. But they want to use that to
mm.
tarnish
And if
Mamdani
I
as
may
a
just interrupt, Nassim, the funniest thing about all this is, yeah, they're constantly attacking him for being an Islamist. And then these pictures of his wife emerge. She's Syrian. You know, she doesn't wear the hijab. She dresses in a way that's indistinguishable from other women in New York, except that she's a lot more stylish. And now she's being condemned by the
yeah.
same people who condemn Mamdani for being an Islamist for not dressing like a quote unquote proper Muslim. I mean, you know, these people's appetite is insatiable.
Hmm.
And the minute you begin to try to appease them, you're finished. Because as Yasser Arafat said, it's a striptease that doesn't end until you're stark naked.
Hmm. Thanks for that. Well, I think we'll probably return to this topic once again because it's going to be a long campaign for him. But as usual, you know, yeah, thank you for your analysis and all your thoughts. See you again next week, and those who
Thank you.
did tune in, you know, join us again to listen to Mouin and see our review of Palestine this week. Bye bye.